welcome back to my channel. So I got a comment recently on an older body mod Q&A video asking, how does one shrink your stretched lobes? And I've never actually looked into it before on how to go about doing that, just because I'm not at a point yet where I want to shrink my stretched lobes, because in case you didn't know, I do have stretched lobes, and I've never gotten to a point where I want to go down a size, so I've never really looked into it. But that did get me thinking a little bit about how exactly do you shrink your lobes? Because like we hear that there's like the point of no return and that there are certain sizes that once you get to it, you can't shrink it and all of these things, but what actually can you do to shrink it? Can you actually shrink it? And how much can you anticipate it to shrink to? So I did a little research and I thought I would bring you how to shrink your stretched lobes. You know, times change, people, and sometimes what made us happy before, what we were interested in doing before, is no longer what we want. The same could be said for body mods. You know, you may have stretched your lobes and they made you happy for a little bit, and then all of a sudden you're kind of like, I really want to go back to a normal size, but how do I do that once I've gotten to this point? Again, I'm personally not at the point of wanting to downsize, but I do anticipate it in the future. I don't know when that will happen. I don't know when it will strike my fancy to be like, hey, I want a more normal size. Let's start this process. But I do feel like I will get to that point. You know, whatever reason it is that you want to downsize, hopefully this video will help you. So the first thing is, can you shrink your stretched lobes? And the short answer is, yes, you can. However, how much you can shrink it really depends on a number of factors. Something to keep in mind is that the skin on your lobes is very elastic. It's stretchy. You know, look at your cartilage, no stretch there. Look at your lobes, pretty dang stretchy. Especially when you look at like what size you were originally at and what size you've gotten to now. There are so many people who are at a much larger size than I am, and so many people who are at a much smaller size than I am. But it's remarkable just how much you can stretch this, like how large you can actually get your lobes to go. So they're very elastic, which makes it easy to stretch as well as to downsize a bit. So again, there are a number of factors that you need to keep in mind when stretching your lobes as well as downsizing your lobes. Some of those factors are how well you took care of your stretched lobes, both during the stretching process and then even after. If you experienced any blowouts during the stretching process, or if you sped the process up too fast. You also need to look at like your skin type, your anatomy, how big your stretched lobes are currently, and then how long have your lobes been stretched to that size. So how much your lobes will eventually downsize depends on all of these factors. And unfortunately, it is pretty unpredictable. Some people notice that they can go back to their like initial size of an 18 or 16 gauge or even a 20 gauge. Some people notice that they can't get past like a 6. Now, if you've been at a larger size for numerous years, the chance of shrinking back to like a 14 gauge isn't impossible. However, it can be a little bit more difficult. And of course, then we hear like the statement of like a 00 gauge is like the point of no return. This isn't true for everyone. This just seems to be like a general understanding. But again, not true for everyone. You may be at a 00 gauge and find that you can't shrink back to your normal size or your initial size. It just really depends on all those other factors that I listed before, especially like your skin type and the elasticity, as well as how well you cared for your stretch lobes. Again, this isn't always accurate that the 00 is like the point that you shouldn't go past. However, it can make it a little bit easier to get back to those smaller sizes if you don't go past that size. So now that you have been given hope that yes, you can shrink your lobes in some matter, how can you go about shrinking your lobes? So I did find that there were 2 big ways on how to shrink stretch lobes. The first one is the one that really comes to my mind, and that is leaving the jewelry out. When you have that size jewelry in your stretch lobe, it's gonna stay that size. So the best thing to do is to take it out. A lot of people recommend taking out the jewelry for about a week. Don't have anything in there, and then after a week, see how much it's closed up. Like, can you still get this jewelry through there, or is it a little bit more tight now? Again, if you keep putting the same size in there that you're currently stretched at, it's not gonna shrink. So you just gotta leave that jewelry out. Also, a week's time kind of gives you a good idea of how much to expect or like anticipate that your lobes will shrink down to. Another method that I found that a lot of people recommend is to just downsize your jewelry. So you know, when you stretched your lobes, you went through the process of going up sizes each stretch. Now you do the opposite. So for example, if you're at a 00 gauge, you would then put in 0 gauge size jewelry. When you did that step before, you did 0 gauge and then went to double 0 gauge. Now you're just gonna do the opposite. You're just gonna go backwards. It's almost like you need the stretching kit again, but to go backwards. By putting smaller jewelry in your stretch lobes, it does allow for the skin to like kind of close down around it. Some people may notice that their jewelry falls out during this process. At that time, you would need to do like almost like a half size step down. So you know how sometimes they recommend doing the 1 gauge when you're stretching up? So instead of going from 2 to 0, you do 2, 1, 0, even though 1's not as common. Kind of be the same. So if you had a 0 gauge and you notice that the 2 gauge jewelry is falling out, do that half size, even though it sounds like a full size. Do that half size at a 1 gauge and see what that does. If the jewelry continues to fall out even when you've tried that, maybe the method of just leaving jewelry out for an entire week is the better one. Another thing you can do to kind of help with the downsizing process is to massage vitamin E oil into your stretch lobes. So massaging vitamin E oil into your stretch lobes helps circulate blood flow. And this can help break down scar tissue that has built up during your stretching process and then having your lobes at this size for however long you had it at. And this is something that you would just keep up with your routine and you may notice that it shrinks a considerable amount. This may not be the case with everyone. You may just notice a small amount of shrinkage. Some people have seen a really noticeable shrinkage, but a lot of people have recommended that vitamin E oil is a great way to help that process along. Also, it's just good general practice to like put oil on your stretch lobes and massage them, and it just helps with the overall health of your lobe. However, something to keep in mind is that the shrinkage just from massaging vitamin E oil onto the lobe will eventually stop. It's not gonna just keep going and going and going. It will get to a point where it just stops and you don't notice any more shrinkage, but hopefully that can at least get you to a point of being content with that size. Also, again, something to keep in mind, I mentioned this as one of the factors on whether or not you can downsize, is dependent how large you stretch to. A lot of this deals with much smaller stretches. So like even for me, I'm at 1/2 inch stretch, which is past the point of no return. However, it is still small enough, like if I take my jewelry out, it is still small enough that I do think I could get some kind of shrinkage. Now, there will be people with really large stretches, like you can notice them. They may have a little bit more difficult time. None of this may work for them. It may work a little bit, but there are gonna be cases where all of this just doesn't work out for you. There is the option for surgery, where you can basically reconstruct your earlobes. This is usually a pretty simple procedure. It doesn't take very long. I'm pretty sure it's outpatient. I've actually known someone who had this process done because even though they didn't stretch their lobes, they would wear like heavier jewelry and it would just pull down on the ear. Again, your lobes are very elastic. And so it would pull down on their ear and they would notice that like studs would just completely fall through. So they had the surgery to basically reconstruct their lobes and they're very happy with it. So that is an option. It is definitely a more expensive one. It's a little bit more invasive, but if you do find that you've tried everything to shrink your lobes and it's just not at a place that you are really content with it, there is the option for lobe reconstruction. And if anyone has ever gone through that before, leave it in the comments below and like your experience with it. It does seem like it's a pretty simple enough thing to do. Just again, expensive, luckily not super time consuming, but will take a chunk out of your day. So if you are considering shrinking your lobes, but you're not entirely sure like how you should go about it, or even if it's, you know, possible to do, hopefully this video helped you a little bit. Let me know in the comments below if you yourself are thinking about shrinking your stretch lobes, have gone through the process of shrinking your stretch lobes, what size you were at and what size you are now, or if you're like me and you've got stretch lobes and you haven't gotten to a point of wanting to shrink them yet, but you feel like it might happen at some point. Leave all of that in the comments below. I'm very interested to hear about your experiences. Special thank you to my patrons. You can help support the channel on Patreon while having access to videos early, viewing patron-only content, and more. But that is it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to give it a big thumbs up. Go on down there and hit that subscribe button, and also hit that notification bell so that YouTube will let you know when I upload next. But until next time, bye y'all!